What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Bannon Crowley. My co-host here, Colin Martin. How are we doing?
We're doing great. How you been?
It's been good. Uh, we'll talk about why. Starting off, get the elephant in the room out of the way. As you guys know by now, James Harden has been traded to the Clippers, like we expected he would. Maybe coming a little sooner than we expected. I was completely expecting this to get dragged out until about the trade deadline, like we saw before with James Harden. This is going to be his fourth team now in the past few years that he's been on, obviously going from OKC to the Rockets to the Nets to the Sixers to the Clippers now. Now they have Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, James Harden, pretty much all on expiring contracts. So, with this being said, kind of just starting this all off, what are your initial thoughts? Who do you think won this trade? How will this affect the Clippers? How does this affect the Sixers? Just let me know what you think.
Yeah, obviously a ton of factors, as you mentioned. And I've been kind of notorious for coming on here and saying I don't believe in the anti-resting rules just because, I feel like teams are going to talk about injuries and kind of play stuff up. But this is a scenario where we actually see the anti-resting rules come into play because James Harden couldn't just sit on the Philly bench anymore. It wasn't allowed. So it put pressure on the 76ers to actually put this deal through and not have it dragged out to the trade deadline, as we mentioned. With that being said, the deal is done. And I will say, I think it's a good move for both parties for two different reasons. I'll start with the Sixers first. I mean, now they are fully invested in that pairing of Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, and they surround them with some better role players who could be providers if this team makes a deep run, which I think we both anticipate them to do to a certain extent. They pick up some extra draft capital as well. It wasn't necessarily what I think they were looking for, but it is something. And that positions them in a good spot where if Embiid really is on the way out, if they really are going to trade him or he leaves in free agency, they have a little extra something where they could rebuild. Or I think the more likely scenario is they're competing by the trade deadline and they can use that extra draft capital to throw in a trade package for a guy like Zach LaVine or Pascal Siakam, a guy that maybe their teams aren't doing so well by the deadline, but they're competitive players that the Sixers can now attainably get a little more easily. And for the Clippers, obviously, I think this one's pretty clear. They don't have a future. They don't have enough draft picks, anyways, even if they held on to what they had before this trade. So you bring in James Harden, and that brings them into the super team tier with a team like Phoenix. I don't think that necessarily makes them a finals team or really puts them in a position to make a run. That's something that we'll have to wait and see what Harden looks like on the court. But this shows that they're committed to building a super team to try to win the finals this year. And with guys like Kawhi and PG who are going to need rest and historically have been kind of either unhealthy or unavailable on a lot of nights, Harden, who's another guy that kind of falls in that category, at least you'll be able to stagger their minutes and always have a star on the court. When Kawhi and PG would go to the bench, I mean, this Clippers team was all right, but you can't have Bones Highland running your offense. Now you have the ability to stagger minutes, be more competitive at all times. So the Clippers are making a finals push, and I respect it. And I still think, even with this trade, the 76ers could be deep playoff contenders. I think it's a win-win. I think you finally move on from the James Harden era. But with that being said, Banning, you are the in-house Sixers fan. I want to know how you feel.
Yeah, and like you said, this trade just solidifies the belief in Tyrese Maxey. If you guys know, before this season, throughout the whole entire time that we've been doing this podcast, especially going into this year, I've been saying that Tyrese Maxey really is that guy. I know a lot of people like him. They thought, he could be around that 20 point per game average, but this was a guy going into this season that I really had beliefs that this guy would be an all-star. And through the first 3 games, he's putting up 36 and 6, and he has been able to shoot the ball at 56% from three. I talked about before, even before he was shooting 45%. This is one of the best players overall in the league right now. He has been great through the first few weeks, and he's only 22 years old. So he may drop off a little bit. He may not end the season averaging 36 and 6, but he is not even like close to his prime at this point, and he's already putting up these numbers off the pick and roll with Joel Embiid. And these players that they got back, some of them will end up helping out. Robert Covington coming back to the Sixers. Obviously, it's been a long time since he's been there, but guys like KJ Martin, who may potentially have a role, Marcus Morris, Batum, we'll see exactly what happens with all of those guys, but they're still pieces. And with those first round picks that they're going to get, the Sixers will definitely be buyers at the deadline, whether that's for a star player that we talked about before, like Pascal Siakam, which we could easily see happen with Nick Nurse on the Sixers. It would be interesting to see that happen, or even a guy like Zach LaVine, which I think would fill out a lot better, just because you have the aspect of having Embiid and Maxey. You kind of want a guy in the middle because you still need a guy. If you get a guy like Pascal Siakam, having him next to Embiid, I just feel like the fit between Maxey, LaVine, and Embiid fits a little better than Siakam, because then you have Tobias Harris, Siakam, and Embiid, and it's not a terrible fit. But I think the way that they're playing, it would just be easier to go with a guy like Zach LaVine, who's definitely going to be an option. We've known this the past few years, and especially now on an expiring contract. But the Sixers overall, I think both teams are winners in this instance. The Clippers are doing everything to win right now. As we know, a lot of these guys will be out after this season unless they win a championship. But all these guys on expiring contracts, I think both teams come out with what they wanted. And the Sixers, in the end, get some good pieces, some depth that they could either use or continue to trade. I doubt that all these players will be on the team by the end of the season. I do think they'll go out there and try to do another trade at the deadline, whether that's for a star player or even another role guy, because at the end of the day, Tyrese Maxey, Tobias Harris, and Embiid and DeAnthony Melton, all those guys together, Kelly Oubre coming off the bench, we've seen they can still be very competitive throughout the first few games of the season. So even if you go and try to get better role players too, even a guy like OG Anunoby at the deadline could be another option that would help. So either way, I'm happy about this trade as a Sixers fan. I know at first people were expecting a guy like Terrence Mann, but you can't really give up that much if you're the Clippers, considering as of right now, they don't really have any depth. You look at this roster and you expect James Harden and Paul George to start at those guard roles. Then coming off the bench, you have Russell Westbrook and Norm Powell, and then potentially Bones Highland. He's kind of thrown into that third point guard spot right now. So we'll see exactly what happens with him. But outside of that, the big man area, Zubac and Plumlee, and then you have Kawhi and PJ Tucker. So there's definitely still some holes on this Clippers team, but they're going to bank on their all-star MVP type players to get it done. And I mean, I guess the question with that is, I know that going into this season overall, we were kind of on the fence about this Clippers team. Does this make them automatically one of the best teams in the West, or do you still think there's some big holes to fill?
I wouldn't say the holes are big. I definitely am a little bit higher on them now that I know that they have a direction that they're going. They're not just rocking with Kawhi and PG. James Harden is obviously going to be a huge contributor. And I'm really interested to see, as you mentioned, what they do with that lineup. I think the popular consensus is that they're going to go Westbrook, Harden, PG, Kawhi, and Zubac, but they have a lot of versatility with it. And based on the way Bones Highland has started this season, I realistically don't think they can bench him and have him not get any minutes because he is a really good player. They gave up a decent amount of I mean, it wasn't anything crazy, but they gave up a role player and a second round pick at the deadline last year to get Bones Highland. I mean, they want him to get those minutes. I think their bench, although giving up, what they did in this trade, losing Robert Covington is definitely going to be a big hit. I think their bench is solid enough. Obviously, the starting star power is great. It's just going to come down to the health. And I know that's such kind of a cold take because we've seen that a lot the last couple of years. But if this team is at full health, these guys get, 80, 75 games under their belt and have time to mesh, they're going to be really, really good. But the biggest problems we've seen with James Harden, especially what we saw in Brooklyn, is that, yeah, you have all these star players, but they're never playing on the court at the same time, and they don't end up actually getting chemistry. And when it gets time for a playoff run, these guys have barely played with each other, and you fall out early. I do worry that something like that could happen in LA, but the best case scenario, yeah, you have to give this team credit. They're probably going to contend out in the West.
Yeah, because I know before, do you think this rises them out of the play? And I know you had them at the 8th spot. Where do you think they kind of finish the season now with these guys?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to give them credit. And other teams that I had around that area, like Memphis, are obviously taking a huge step back. When we made that video, didn't anticipate that Steven Adams would be done for the entire year, not to mention even more injuries they're having there. So I think Memphis has definitely taken a step back. I think the Clippers overtake them in that regard. And then with this veteran talent that you have on the roster, maybe they arise over a team I had higher than them, like OKC. Maybe if there's injuries ahead of them, they can rise as well. I guess when you look at the talent of the roster, you look at Ty Lue, who has got, kind of discredited in the past for being carried by LeBron, but I think in recent years has solidified himself as one of the best coaches in basketball. This team is too good for me to say they're going to be a play-in team. That was my original take, but looking at what we have now and the production that we've seen early from guys like Kawhi and PG's looked really solid so far. I do have to say, I think they're a little bit better than where I originally had them penciled in.
Yeah, and I think going into this, I had them around the fifth seed and behind the Kings, the Lakers, the Nuggets, and the Suns. And I think even with this addition, I still think they're going to start off a little slow, just overall. And overall, I mean, they have a good rotation going into the playoffs. I do kind of think I wouldn't be surprised if they're still around that fifth spot towards the end of the year, just because those other teams are kind of built better. They already have the regular season experience, and depending on who really plays between these teams, since with the rules, you only have to have two all-star level players playing. So they're still going to be able to get away with this, especially now it's going to be even easier to rest Harden or Kawhi or Paul George on any given night. So I still think they end up around the fifth seed, but definitely some big additions for them. It will shake up this playoff a lot. If my seeding did stay the same and they go up against the Kings in the first round, obviously a very entertaining matchup. I just don't think with this addition, I think James Harden will be able to play very well. He did in Philly. I just don't really see them getting past a team like the Nuggets or the Lakers, who are both deep, or even the Suns, where the Suns have this big three that they built. And you look at the Clippers' big three. I just think the Suns' big three, all those players are better. Plus, they have more depth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings us into our next topic very well. We're talking about new additions. I think the story on everyone's mind right now is Victor Wembenyama. I think we've seen a lot of rookies perform early in the league, some that maybe we haven't expected so far, but I think we should start with Victor here as we do our rookie recap. What have you liked? What have you disliked? And what's your storyline with Victor Wembenyama early in this season?
Yeah, going into this year, I was a little hesitant just to say that I really believe that Victor was that good. But throughout the first few games, I mean, he's looked very good so far. Overall, watching him play, just going out there and being able to make plays offensively and defensively, there's still a lot that he needs to work on, obviously, but so far he has looked like the real deal. There's definitely been some moments. Usually you can tell with some of these rookies right away. You may be able to watch some moments where I'll talk about another player later that they can come out and play amazing. And Victor's definitely had those moments, but there has been some where he's struggled. But overall, he is looking like one of those guys that could be up there by the end of the season for Rookie of the Year. I think it's still pretty close, though, because if we look between some of these guys, I know you're a big fan of Chet so far, and so far, I mean, looking at these stats, he's played amazing throughout the first few games. And if right now, I think it's really between those two guys. I think there's been other guys that have played very well too that we can talk about, but between those two guys, I mean, those have really been the main two guys in the race for the Rookie of the Year right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And to talk about Victor first, because obviously Chet had a lot of hype, but after missing a year, being the second overall pick, people kind of forgot about him to a certain extent. But Victor, nobody was forgetting about. Most talked about story of the offseason, and he had a lot of pressure to come in and perform right away. Even in the preseason, we saw him play really well. And I hate to throw the LeBron comparisons. I mean, one of our most popular videos on the channel is about how he is not LeBron. And I think that's a very correct take. But Victor is doing exactly what Victor needs to do on the Spurs team. Let's not act like he's immediately going to come in and be the best player on this team. It's going to take some time. And the Spurs have some guys like Keldon Johnson and Devin Vassell, which are still realistically the first and second options on that team. Victor is a rookie. He's only 18 years old, 19 years old, and he has to earn his keep. And so far, he's doing that. He's putting up 16 points a night. He's shown flashes. He had a couple one-on-one matchups with Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant, obviously one of the best players in basketball, got the best of him a couple times, but Victor played well in all of those scenarios. Not to mention, I think he's getting a lot of flack for his rebounding, and I get it because he's 7'5" and he's a center, but he's still pulling in 8 rebounds a night. That's no joke. That's NBA starting center level, and I expect that number to go way up. His defense is incredible. As Chet has been doing, they're racking up a lot of blocks because they're lanky and they play a lot of under the rim defense. So credit to them there. And I would say there are some guys that are going to start off slow for rookies. You look at a guy like Scoot Henderson, who we'll bring up. He's been starting pretty rough. And I don't think that necessarily pencils him out, but exactly what you mentioned. When you see a guy start off and look NBA ready like Victor has so far, it's definitely very encouraging for a guy that realistically, before his NBA debut, a lot of casual fans had never seen play basketball.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, Scoot hasn't really played that great throughout the first few games, but as of right now, I really think it's only between Victor and Chet. And talking about Chet, he's played. I mean, you can make an argument that he's been the best rookie throughout the first few weeks. Right now, averaging only a few point 0.7 less points per game, but still putting the same amount of field goals in per game, shooting 13 to 14% better than Victor. He's shooting 52% from the 3-point line to Victor's 26%, and he's attempting more threes per game. They're about the same, and he's just making more than Victor to this point. A better free throw percentage. They're getting about the same rebounds. He's putting in more assists, getting about the same steals, more blocks, less than half of the amount of turnovers that Victor has through his first few games. And it's just interesting to look at because going into this season, it seemed like there was a lot of hype around both of these guys. And I think you could argue that Chet is playing better throughout these first few games than Victor. But it seems like for a guy that was clearly in the race for this rookie of the year, he hasn't really been talked about that much.
Yeah. And to bring up another guy that I don't think either of us expected to talk about at this point, we got to bring up your guy, Derek Lively. Obviously, you were a fan of him. And for fans that have been watching some of our older videos, going into the draft process, I was not very high on Derek Lively. He had the very stereotypical college center skill set, which we've seen doesn't translate into the NBA anymore. But Derek Lively has proven me wrong early because he provides so much more to this Mavericks team. He is not playing like the average rebounder he did at Duke. Right now, he's putting up 8 rebounds, about the same number as Victor, obviously quite a bit shorter. And he's also leading the league in field goal percentage. Derek Lively is taking smart shots. Let's not forget, this is a guy that was absolutely incredible in high school. He was the number one player in the country, and he was allowed to shoot at will. And at Duke, the team obviously struggled and he didn't get to put up the shots he liked to put up. And on the NBA, he gets drafted to the Mavericks with the team with Luka and Kyrie, ball dominant guards. I expected him to struggle with not having the ability to put up the shots he wants to put up. Instead, he's playing smart. He's poised. He's getting almost 10 points a game, getting some assists in there as well, which is very encouraging for a center, of course. But he's just taking the right shots, making the right play. He's dangerous in the pick and roll game. I think as he develops in the league, he'll be great at the pick and pop as well. He's a guy that's proven he can shoot the three ball a little. And for this Mavericks team, I mean, this is a guy that was taken earlier than a lot of people had in their mock drafts. He was supposed to slip. They took the risk to take him early, and he looks like the perfect center to have on this team. And this is a Mavericks team where I had issues with their big men. I talked about in our preview video. Dwight Powell gets not oh, I mean, he gets pushed to the bench, to be realistic with you. I don't really think he should be getting big minutes in the first place. And Derek Lively steps in and has looked great. So I don't think we can mention some of these rookies and make a rookie report without bringing up maybe the most surprising guy, and that would be Derek Lively.
Yeah, and that's where I was talking about earlier. Guys that have been able to go out there and have these 2 or 3 minute bursts where they look incredible. And Derek Lively is that guy. I mean, we've seen some of these games where he's gone out in 2 to 5 minute burst and played like an all-star level guy. And then the rest of the game, he kind of slows down a little bit. But that's very encouraging to look at if you're a Mavericks fan, because Derek Lively starting in that center role already is definitely promising to look at. You see guys like Luka and Kyrie, you expect them to get big points. But outside of that, we both had some questions about the depth on this team. But Derek Lively coming in there and pushing Dwight Powell to the bench is definitely good because now you at least have a guy in Dwight Powell that can come off the bench and be fine for you offensively coming behind Derek Lively, who has been good. He's taken some good shots. I think he does need to open up his shot selection a little more. Obviously, he's leading the league because he's putting up good shots, but there's also a point where you want a guy to put up some more shots, even if their field goal percentage goes down a little bit. You want to see him be comfortable taking those shots. But I guess my question is now, with him coming out here playing well, with Luka playing at an MVP caliber level, I know you didn't have the Mavericks playing, making the playoffs at all. Now they're one of the two only undefeated teams up to this point. Do you think they're back into the playoff race, or do you still not completely believe in them?
I think a bit of both. I think they are going to be in the playoff race, but if they're a team that people are trying to tell me is a lock for the playoffs, I still am a little bit out on them. Derek Lively is great. Don't get me wrong. I just wanted my whole little rant about him, but I still don't think he's consistently going to be one of the better centers in basketball. He's a rookie. He has a lot of time. That's just not going to be this year. Luka is playing at an MVP level, and don't get me wrong, that is incredible, but we're already seeing Kyrie not be fully available for games. And I know it's early. I know he needs rest. He's had injury problems throughout a lot of his career, so I do get it, but you need both of them on the court at the same time if this team's going to make the playoffs. They're starting out hot, don't get me wrong, but I don't care how well your best player is playing. If you're not going to get solid contributions from anyone else in that starting lineup, you're not going to win games down the stretch. And this is kind of what we've seen from the Mavericks in the past. Luka is one of the best players in basketball. We see him play amazing all the time. The first game that comes to my mind is last year, that 40-point triple-double. It might have been 50 against the Knicks on the road. That game is incredible, and that team still wasn't competitive last year. They just are missing too many guys. I think if they, at the deadline, they can go out and try to find a better version of a guy like Josh Green or Grant Williams, who they're starting at the 3 and the 4, then maybe this team could figure it out down the stretch. They just don't have a whole lot of assets, and to be honest, they don't have a lot of guys that I'm confident in being guys that are, solid contributors throughout the regular season to make a playoff push. If this Mavericks team can make the playoffs, they have enough talent, they have enough of a clutch gene to perform once they're there. But when we get to the middle of the season, we get some tough games in late December, early January. Who's going to show up for this Mavericks team besides Luka? And as of now, I don't really see anyone.
Yeah, and I was actually just talking about that game before this. He dropped 60, 21, and 10. I know we were watching that game. And Luka, I mean, obviously in that MVP race, but as of right now, throughout the first few games, there are some other guys that I do want to talk about. Just some other guys in the draft that went high. Obviously, Asor and Amen Thompson. Like I talked about before, Asor definitely being able to get into that starting role, and we have seen that so far. He's getting about 30 minutes per game, putting up 10 points. His field goal percentage about 40%, so definitely still a little to look out for. He's putting up only 2 threes a game. He's shooting 10%. Not good so far. Amen at 18%. They just have to figure out how to get those good shots up. But besides that, I mean, he's getting 9.8 rebounds per game, 4 assists, 10 points, and almost a steal and 2 blocks. So Asor definitely playing very well through these first few games. I know Amen, too, coming off of the bench. He hasn't had as much of a role. He's only about 17 minutes, kind of where I expected. He is shooting a little bit better, but between these two guys, obviously both going very high in the top 5. I said Asor probably has the better chance to be a better player right away, just because he's going to get more minutes right away. And he's looked very good, putting up a double-double so far with 2 blocks. But both of these guys, I think once Amen really gets his shot, will be able to go out there. And some other guys, too, coming off of the bench. Brandon Podziemski putting up 5 points a game. He's been able to come in and get a few buckets for the Warriors, shooting pretty well overall. And Sasha Vezenkov for the Kings so far. He's played pretty well. He's getting about 16 minutes. It looks like his role is going to increase a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one last guy to throw in there, a guy that obviously went early, but it's kind of flying under the radar because the Hornets are so bad. I mean, Brandon Miller has looked like the most NBA ready rookie out of anyone so far. And I think that includes Victor and Chet. He's been up 15, 6, and 2. He's one of the first options on this Hornets offense, some nights even above LaMelo. I expect him to have a really good season. I don't necessarily think he's going to win the Rookie of the Year award, but do not be surprised if he's a guy that's hanging around in the top 3 for pretty much the whole season.
Yeah, and kind of going towards the opposite area, as we know, it's starting this week. We're going to have the first games of the NBA play-in tournament. And if you guys don't know, that's obviously new to the NBA this season. We're going to have a bunch of different teams in these different pod areas. They're going to have some play-in games. They're going to play against each other, and then that'll be going on throughout the whole entire season. They dropped the courts and what they're going to look like, what the players are going to be playing on. And it's basically an incentive to get the players to actually play some regular season games. We're going to see more, hopefully more star level players and all-star players get to actually play during the regular season. So something to look out for. And I guess as of right now, I kind of want to ask you, how do you think this is going to go? Kind of a little bit of the preview to start off. Since it's going to go throughout the whole season, obviously we'll be updated every single week, but kind of maybe a prediction of how some of these teams are going to fare throughout the season.
Yeah, and I think this sort of tournament bodes very well for teams that have kind of had a core together for a little while now. I love the Celtics. I think they could do good in this, but a team like the Nuggets, who is basically running back the same lineup that just won them a finals last year, and a team that has something to prove. I mean, they're not covered or respected by the media nearly as much as teams like LA or Boston or even New York are. I mean, they get disrespected sometimes and they play probably the highest level of basketball that there is. I think a team like that bodes very well. When it comes to teams that have superstars that aren't always available, I know they just built this way, just were built this way. But the Clippers, for example, I mean, they are a very talented roster. I'm sure people will predict that they win the in-season tournament, but I don't see it happening because realistically, yeah, these games are extra incentive, but is that incentive going to be enough to convince Kawhi, PG, and Harden to all play on the same night? Who really knows? I trust the teams that have shown good health and have kind of stuck together with at least two of their best players. So honestly, in my notes, I have the Celtics written down here, but based on my logic, I think a team like the Nuggets is the exact type of team that would win this. If you want a dark horse, let's look at the Sacramento Kings. I mean, they're really bringing back the same guys. We know they're one of the most competitive teams out in the West. I think the Kings are another team that, with Mike Brown at the helm, have a lot to show. They think they're one of the best teams in basketball. And if they go and win the inaugural in-season tournament, I think that puts a little bit of a chip on their shoulder and obviously some extra money in their pockets.
Yeah, I'm gonna go to the opposite side here over in the East, just because in the West, looking at it, it's kind of tough with these groups because if we're talking about the West B group, we're gonna have the Nuggets, the Clippers, the Pelicans, the Mavericks, and the Rockets. I don't expect them to do much, but between those top four teams, I mean, only two of these teams can end up making past the group play. So if we're looking at that, obviously, if you look at it, you would say probably the Nuggets and the Clippers may be the best teams overall. But at the end of the day, it is regular season games. So we're going to see some guys play on and off. And you never really know between a team like the Pelicans and the Mavericks. Luka could go out there and win some of those games. If we're looking in the East, though, when we look at the East C group between we have the Celtics, the Raptors, the Nets, the Bulls, and the Magic. I wouldn't be surprised if the Celtics win every single game in that group. Another area too, the East A, we have the Sixers, the Cavs, the Hawks, the Pacers, and the Pistons. I would expect the Sixers and the Cavs to be able to easily roll through those two teams. The rest of the teams in that area. The B group, kind of tough too, between the Bucks, the Knicks, the Heat, the Wizards, and the Hornets. I mean, three of those teams that I mentioned before between the Bucks, the Knicks, and the Heat, I would expect that all three of those teams probably close to making the playoffs if they don't all make it. So only two of those teams can advance too. So another thing to look at. But as of right now, I think it would be pretty easy for this Celtics team to run through that division and easily get through. Maybe another team out there too. Obviously, I think the Sixers will do well in this tournament. In the West, it is tough too because even in the A group, you have teams like the Lakers, the Suns, the Grizzlies, the Blazers, and the Jazz. And overall, obviously the Blazers and the Jazz aren't great, but only the Lakers, the Grizzlies, and the Suns, only two of those teams can make it through.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of competition based on the way it's built. You hope that teams take this seriously. We get some high level basketball. And at the end of the day, basketball is interesting because teams can go on losing streaks, but it's not a game like baseball where there's a point where the games don't matter. Regular season basketball mattered anyways, and now it's put on the higher stage. Obviously, some of the more casual fans are going to tune in. They see alternate jerseys, brand new court designs. It's going to be very hyped up by NBA social media. I think it's good for the game, getting more eyes on basketball that in the past people would claim didn't matter, especially it's coming on Thursday nights. It's not going to be Saturday prime time or, Sunday when everybody's at home. It's going to be at an interesting time where realistically, a lot of fans might not have been watching basketball. I think it's going to be great for the game, no matter who comes out on top, no matter how long the play-in tournament really matters in basketball. They're going to have the bragging rights to say they were the first team to win the play-in. So I think this year, especially, teams are going to be really into it. And at least I hope they're ready to go and we get the best type of basketball every Thursday night.
Yeah, and kind of bouncing that over to the NFL. Obviously, so far through these first few weeks, we're almost to the halfway point of the season at this point, getting past the trade deadline. And My main question now, with everything that's gone down after the trade deadline, some teams got some additions, but it seems like a lot of the top teams kind of stayed about the same. There is some question marks around pretty much every team in the NFL right now. The past few weeks, we've seen the 49ers go down a little bit. We've seen the Eagles be on the edge for a lot of games, but I want to go to the opposite side in the AFC because I know Patrick Mahomes hasn't had some great games the past few weeks. Obviously, we've seen other teams like the Ravens and the Dolphins and the Bengals bounce back too. So, who is your favorite right now in the AFC?
Yeah, and I definitely thought about this quite a bit. I'm not fully out on Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. We've seen their dominance in the past. I think they're going to be great. If you want to know where my money's at, I have a bet on the Ravens to make the Super Bowl out in the AFC. But if you want my honest answer, I do think it's the Miami Dolphins. They took a tough loss to the Eagles a couple weeks ago, which doesn't bode well, especially because they would be one of their biggest competitors out in the NFC. But they came out firing against New England exactly how they were supposed to. And based on what we've seen, there's a lot of teams that are hot right now. I think there's still an argument that Miami is the hottest team in all of football. I mean, Tua is probably still the front runner for the MVP. If you ask me right now, it's Tyreek Hill. So obviously 2 Dolphins there. Raheem Mostert has taken a step back. He is an older back, but we saw some of his magic early in the year, and I expect him to pick it back up pretty soon. And my biggest question with this Miami team, I like everything they do on offense. As we know, their coaching is great. Their secondary has even looked better than I expected. But my biggest question to start the year was their run defense. I anticipated their run defense to be really, really good, like top 5 level. And right now we've been seeing them play mediocre in that 17 through 14 range. If they step up, then this team is fully complete. Right now, the way to beat the Dolphins is to run all over them. We saw in that Philly game, Jalen Hurts got some design QB carries, but DeAndre Swift had himself a game. This Dolphins defense is not easy to throw over, especially with Jalen Ramsey coming back from injury. But so far, they've been vulnerable because teams can run against them. If my guy Christian Wilkins and a couple of those other studs on that line, such as Jalen Phillips and anyone that they substitute on the edge, whether it be Bradley Chubb or any of the depth that they have there, if they can just guard the run, this team is going to be a Super Bowl contender, if not the favorite out in the AFC. They just need to do that because everything else I've seen, I've been a big fan of. So with that being said, only really missing one specific part of their game. I think the Dolphins have easily impressed me the most. And I would say, as of now, they probably are the best team in the AFC.
Yeah, and before this, I think that I still have the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl, but I want to go in an opposite direction than that. I still think they probably are the best team overall, but another team in that kind of same area is the Ravens. I mean, Lamar Jackson has played like his MVP self this season so far. He's been playing fantastic, running the ball, throwing the ball. He's been great. And like we said before, I mean, throughout the first 8, 9 weeks in the NFL, this AFC North has played out exactly how I think both of us expected it to go. Looking at all these teams right now in the AFC North, I mean, we have the Ravens at 6-2, and then the Steelers, Browns, and Bengals all at 4-3. All of these teams right now, if the playoffs were to start, would probably all be in the playoffs, depending on the tiebreakers. But all these teams above 500, and there's been some question marks around all of them, but they've all been able to rise up. I don't think we expected the Bengals to be in last place throughout this moment, but they're still only 2 games or about a game and a half behind the Ravens, which is interesting to look at. But this Ravens team with Lamar Jackson, I mean, they're 6-2. We've seen when he's healthy, this team's ceiling in the regular season specifically, they can win as many games as they need to make a number 1 or number 2 seed. And he's just been fantastic for this team. Guys like Zay Flowers have come in and been great additions for them. And Lamar has got his legs back, especially coming off of those injuries. You always wonder if these players are going to be able to come back and rush the same way that they were before. And he has clearly. I mean, getting 3 touchdowns throughout this whole month of October on the ground has been fantastic for him. He's had big games too, where he's thrown for 3 touchdowns a game. He's kind of limited those turnovers that we've seen before too, hasn't thrown that many picks to start the season. And in a very competitive division, the Ravens have come out on top. And they look like, honestly, if I'm picking a team kind of outside the Chiefs, I'm still going to roll with the Chiefs. But if they ran into the Ravens right now, it would be a very interesting game to say the least. And I think that's really the biggest threat. Though we are going to see the Chiefs and the Dolphins battle this week. So potentially a game to see who really is the best team right now in the AFC.
Yeah, and that's going to be a great game. Shout out to if any of our fans live in Germany. I mean, you guys are getting a good one over there. But to get kick it over to the other side of the NFL. Let's talk about the NFC real quick because the 49ers were a team that I think a lot of people had penciled in as the best team in the NFC, but due to injuries and honestly just poor play, we've seen them falter off a little bit. They just lost it to the Bengals in a pretty big upset, and I think a lot of the questions rely around Brock Purdy at quarterback. With that being said, I think we both predicted them to make it to that point, at least in the upcoming weeks we have. But with Brock Purdy kind of stepping back and looking like the seventh round draft pick that he originally was, do we think he's the reason the 49ers can't win the Super Bowl this year? Or would you still take this 49ers team as a legit contender?
Yeah, this 49ers team for the past 10 or 15 years has been a quarterback away from winning a Super Bowl, and they're still in that spot. We saw what happened last year in the playoffs. I know Brock Purdy got hurt, but coming back this year, he played very well through the first few weeks. And then we saw Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, all the weapons get hurt, and he just hasn't been able to play as well as we've seen before. He's putting up the past 2 weeks, he's had 4 interceptions to 2 touchdowns, and he's had a lot of great throws. I mean, he's getting about 300, 400 yards per game, but he went up against Cincinnati and Joe Burrow, and that team was struggling, but they came back and they beat the 49ers by 2 scores, and Joe Burrow proved that he's still that guy. 3 touchdowns, 300 yards, and only 4 incompletions. Brock Purdy throwing 2 picks. You can't do that when you're going up against these elite level teams because they're going to take advantage of that. Now they're on a 3-game losing streak against the Browns, against the Vikings, and you should not be losing a game against the Vikings up to this point. At that point, it seemed like their season was completely over. They were tanking. Now they've turned it around a little bit. Now they're going up against the Jaguars. And next week, if they go up against the Jaguars, they have a bye week this week to figure it out. But if they don't figure it out and they go up against the Jaguars, you lose 4 games in a row. You're at 5-4. It doesn't look very good for you, especially in the NFC West, where we have a lot of teams this year that are playing a lot better than we expected. I know the Seahawks, you expected them to play very well. They have so far. They're 5-2. The Rams played very good to start the season. Now they're 3-5. They've fallen off a little bit, but there's still definitely some competition in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll play the other side of this argument a little bit because we have seen teams without elite quarterback play win Super Bowls in the past. We're on a stretch now where it's been a little while, so I get the other side of the argument. But let's not forget in 2016 when we saw a shell of Peyton Manning win it all with the Broncos. And it's really just because he had an elite defense and elite players around them. So if we're talking about this 49ers team as a whole, they brought in Chase Young, who, let's not forget, he was the defensive rookie of the year in 2020. And he's dealt with injuries. He's dealt with, chemistry problems with the Washington organization. But on the field, he's playing opposite side of Nick Bosa while still having a guy like Fred Warner, who is the best linebacker in football, ready to man that defense. This defense down the stretch, I expect them to clutch up and make the plays that we've seen them kind of allow too often, especially in that Vikings game. They kind of let up a little too much, especially to a rookie like Jordan Addison. I don't expect that to be the story for the rest of the season. I think they figure things out back there. And whether Chase Young is a star player or just a rotational guy, giving up a 3rd-round pick for a 49ers team that's trying to go the distance, it's a risk I'd be willing to take. Let's not forget to mention, though, Brock Purdy is not a great quarterback. We know this, but he does have the best weapons in all of football. Does that make him a great quarterback? Probably not. Does it make this 49ers team able to win a Super Bowl? I think so. Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, all of these guys are playing like Pro Bowlers. For some of them, arguably one of the best players in their positions. And when it comes to Brock Purdy, he is not great at moving the ball down the field, but that's what these star players are for. And when they get into the red zone, he is one of the better red zone quarterbacks in all of football. I know he's had a tough couple of weeks. I've been tripping over my words this episode because Brock Purdy does have me a little bit confused. I can't really tell you if he's one of the worst quarterbacks in the league or not, because when he is in the red zone, when his team can get him the distance, he performs well. He makes great throws and he finds his playmakers in the spots that a lot of quarterbacks wouldn't. But in terms of actually moving down the field, he is not very good at doing it on his own. We saw it at Iowa State and we're seeing it now. This offense relies a lot on big plays. Luckily for them, Kyle Shanahan is one of the best coaches in the league at drawing up big plays. It's probably him or Mike McDaniel at this point, and he hasn't had to do a whole lot. But when it gets down to the crunch time, if Debo has struggles with more injuries, Kittle, CMC, we've seen issues with them as well. Can he lead drives down the field that lead to game-winning, plays? I don't think so. If he has his stars around him, if the defense holds their opponents to 20 points or less, I think this 49ers team is good enough. So if the question is, will Brock Purdy hold them back from winning the Super Bowl? I don't think so. But admittedly, they're going to need a lot of help around him, which they have seemed to build.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll be honest, I'll come out here and say it. I don't think they can win a Super Bowl with Brock Purdy at the quarterback. We've seen the 49ers, they went up against the Chiefs when Jimmy Garoppolo was there, and that was really the same idea that we're seeing now. I mean, the 49ers have a better system built around them. They had a very good defense, but tie game 49ers were up at 1.2 in the clutch time though. When we got to the fourth quarter, the better quarterback prevailed in Patrick Mahomes. And when we look through history, I mean, the past few years, even too, we saw Kansas City go against Jalen Hurts this year in the Super Bowl. And Jalen Hurts against Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes was the better quarterback. He ended up winning that game, especially when it was close towards the end. I mean, before that, too, we saw Matthew Stafford and Joe Burrow. And that was an instance, too, where Joe Burrow, that was really his first year of being really good. And we saw that happen last year with Jalen Hurts, too. His first year of being really good. And they just couldn't get over the hump at the end. The better quarterback ended up going down and getting the game-winning drive in pretty much all these Super Bowls recently. We saw Tom Brady against Patrick Mahomes, too. Tom Brady went out there, they won that game. That was an instance where we've seen kind of two of the top quarterbacks go against each other. We also saw, I mean, before we saw the Rams go against the Patriots, too. Tom Brady went out there and he got things done. The Rams offense just couldn't do anything. So every single year, the better quarterback ends up prevailing. And if we're talking about games like this, I mean, you throw the 49ers up against the Eagles right now. If that's a close game in the NFC Championship and it comes down to one drive, I'm taking Jalen Hurts over Brock Purdy because the weapons between those two teams, the 49ers have better guys, but Jalen Hurts just knows what to do. He's a better quarterback up to this point. And even if they make the Super Bowl, if you're giving me the 49ers up against, I mean, any of these AFC teams right now, I'm going to take the Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes. I'm going to take the Ravens with Lamar Jackson. I mean, I'd even take the Jaguars with Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, a better quarterback at this point. Even the Bengals, I'm going to take them with Joe Burrow. And at the end of the day, I just don't see this 49ers team winning a Super Bowl with Brock Purdy.
Yeah, I can definitely understand both sides here. At the end of the day, Brock Purdy doesn't need to be one of the best quarterbacks in the league, but in the big moment, he has to play like one of them, and that's a pretty high expectation. With that being said, I mean, Matthew Stafford on the Rams, his first year was incredible, don't get me wrong, but statistically, he wasn't like a top 10 quarterback in the league at that point. Just in the playoff stretch when it mattered, he stepped up and played like one. So if the 49ers do make a run, I think Brock Purdy would have to do something similar. Would definitely be easier said than done, but if any team is going to be able to do it without a quarterback, I think we know it's the 49ers, so maybe I hold a little bit more faith there.
Yeah, and I think honestly, if we're gonna see this happen, we're gonna need to see Brock Purdy play like Nick Foles in the Super Bowl at this point. He's gonna really need to have this massive moment, but throughout the past few weeks, it just doesn't seem like he really has that in him, which at the end of the day, that's not terrible, but you're still banking on this guy who was a seventh round pick. He's played very well, and he may be able to turn things around, but the real question is if he doesn't, what do the 49ers do? Because you still got rid of Trey Lance, who was the guy that you invested a lot into, and you're in this very weird area because you can't really go out there and get a top end quarterback in the draft unless something slips this year. I mean, we could end up seeing, depending on where a guy like Michael Penix goes, I don't know. It's a very interesting spot to see the 49ers right now. If Brock Purdy doesn't figure it out by the end of the year, and I think that's definitely a possibility, what do you do?
Yeah, and Banning, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm a pretty big sports optimist, but the answer is you're screwed. The 49ers made their decision in Brock Purdy. If they kept around Trey Lance and, let him sit on the bench awkwardly, it might have screwed up team chemistry, but at least it would have given you an option where you could have rolled back to if you had to. They're confident in Purdy enough where they're not doing that. Obviously, no one else was confident with him on draft day. I don't even think the 49ers were even bought into catching him. They just let him slip and, they fell into the 49ers lap. So shout out to Brock Purdy. I mean, he is exceeding expectations already. But to be honest with you, if the 49ers don't win it this year or maybe the next one, then they dug themselves into a hole because there's nothing you can do at the quarterback position. People will throw around the trade for Kirk Cousins thing. Obviously, with his injury, that wasn't going to happen this year. And honestly, they probably weren't going to go out and acquire him anyways because they do like Brock Purdy. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to deal with building a team around a subpar quarterback if Brock Purdy doesn't step up. So to be honest with you, Banning, I don't know what you do if you're the 49ers. It's definitely a little bit scary because now you're putting your full faith into a dude that honestly wasn't even a good quarterback in college and hasn't proven a whole lot yet in the NFL. I think he figures it out. I think he's shown enough good flashes where I think this 49ers team won't regret their decision of picking him over Trey Lance. But I mean, that could age very, very poorly. And I think the 49ers management has to have that on their mind.
Yeah, and it's definitely an interesting spot too because he plays good enough. This team is good enough outside of him that you're contending every single year, and we've seen that before. Even with Jimmy Garoppolo, they were contending every single year, and I don't think Jimmy Garoppolo was really that great of a quarterback, but he got it done when he needed to, except obviously when they were in the Super Bowl. But you're in a spot too that even I know the Patriots were in a few years ago. You go with a guy, they Instead, with Tom Brady, obviously Tom Brady a lot better than Brock Purdy, but he was definitely declining at that point in age. Obviously he went out and won with the Bucks, but they got rid of everything else in the background, and now we see where the Patriots are. They kind of got lucky getting that high pick with Mac Jones, but you could also say that Mac Jones hasn't been that lucky for the Patriots either. The 49ers in this same instance where if Brock Purdy doesn't work out, you're very screwed because what do you go with after that? You sign a guy in free agency. How good is a guy that you're going to get in free agency that other teams don't really want? You don't really want another bridge quarterback. You're not going to be bad enough where you can tank with all these guys that you were signing, trading for Chase Young too, all these other guys. So it's a very interesting spot that I feel like a lot of people aren't talking about what could really happen with this 49ers team if they fail, because we know how good they are and we know that they could win a Super Bowl. But if Brock Purdy isn't the guy, there's not really a lot of people talking about what would happen.
Yeah, absolutely. One last thing I'll throw in about this is fortunately for the 49ers, if they continue to compete, but then find out that, or, come to the realization that Brock Purdy isn't their option, they are a very tempting free agency destination for quarterbacks. I will give you that. It's a very friendly offense. They're going to have weapons around it. I mean, San Francisco as a city is beautiful, great weather, a good history there. So maybe if a quarterback that kind of gets thrown to the dirt from his old team, the first guy that's coming to my mind is a guy like Dak Prescott. Maybe if you can get a short-term deal with a guy like him, not specifically Dak, but a guy kind of in that range that's not necessarily old and washed up, but definitely towards their decline, could maybe use a little bit of scenery change. Maybe San Francisco is a spot for that, but definitely they really need Brock Purdy to work out because that would be the best case scenario if he doesn't. And realistically, that might not even be a great option.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to look forward to too. Obviously, they're going to go up against the Jaguars in 2 weeks. They have the bye week to figure it out this week, but a lot of questions overall too in the NFL. I mean, we're halfway through, and it seems like there's been a lot of teams that are at the top. There's a lot of teams that started off well. There's a lot of teams that started off bad, and they figured it out. So, still a lot to talk about through these next few weeks in the NFL, right before we start to get that playoff picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many big games coming up. We're at this point in the NFL season where when you look at games down the stretch in the preseason, you don't really know what's going to end up being a big game because teams impress or fail early off, and then we see the story of their season. But now that we have seen enough of these teams to get a good read on them, we know which games are going to be competitive and which ones aren't going to be. And I'll say, I mean, even compared to recent years, it seems like this playoff picture is more confusing than usual. There's so many teams that would be in if it ended today that we didn't see as being competitive. And there's teams like the Bengals who are maybe on the outside looking in, who we both expected to finish near the top of the AFC. So a lot of football left to be played, but definitely some big matchups to watch out for. This is usually the part of the NFL season where we get to nominate the contenders and kind of kick off the pretenders.
Yeah, so a lot to talk about through these next few weeks, and we'll see you guys next week.
See you guys.